Back in July of 2013, I was doing a little solo backpacking around the Olympic Peninsula up in Washington State, with various stops in the Olympic National Park. A few days in, I happened to stop in Quinault and ended up on some random road that dead-ended on a beautiful spot at the edge of the Quinault River. It really was something to see. There was this old footbridge that led across the river, and it looked like something out of the Lord of the Rings. With it being July, it was way too hot outside, and there I am, all alone with all this crisp, clean, cool-looking water just sitting there in front of me. By that point, I don't think I'd actually washed properly for maybe 4 or 5 days, so I wasn't exactly feeling at my freshest. You can probably guess what came next. I drove my car all the way to the edge of the dead-end road, turned it around just in case I needed to get out of there in a hurry, then started hiking down an embankment to the edge of the water with a towel in hand. I didn't have any swimwear with me at the time, but I made a note to pick some up in the future and figured a quick dip in my underwear could have me nice and clean without feeling too exposed. It sounds weird considering how deep in the woods I was. I mean, it seemed like I was totally alone. But heavy emphasis on seemed because, as it turned out, I wasn't totally alone. You know how people talk about that feeling of being watched? It seems like a total cliche, doesn't it? Like surely it depends on how paranoid the person is. Well, I'm not in the least bit paranoid, and I'd go so far as to say I'm something of an exhibitionist. I have friends that would rather pony up for a hotel just to use the bathroom, hence why I was backpacking alone. I didn't feel like I was being watched necessarily, so much as it dawned on me that what I was doing was just a bad idea. I couldn't work out why at first. It's not like great whites are known to swim up into the Quinault, but in the end, it just felt like I was too exposed, too vulnerable. I tried telling myself I was being irrational, but I just couldn't seem to shake the feeling. So, after just a few minutes of scrubbing, I climbed out of the river, then walked over to the spot I'd stashed my clothes and towel. As I'm walking up the embankment, keep in mind that I have my back to the other side of the river, and since I was at my clothes and towel, it kind of felt like I was at a home base. Yet just when that feeling of exposure and vulnerability was going away, I happened to catch a glimpse of something on the opposite bank. I honestly thought it was a bear or something at first glance, but it quickly became obvious that a bear was the least of my troubles at that moment. Standing on the opposite side of the river, a little higher up than me, was a man. It looked like every single item of clothing he was wearing had been hand-stitched and made from animal hide. His hair kind of looked like dreadlocks, but I later realized that some of his hair strands looked more like they'd been woven around twigs. He looked like a full-on mountain man. Like I remember my skin crawling when I saw my boyfriend playing that dumb cowboy game years later. He was obsessed with making animal clothes, and one of his outfits looked almost exactly like my peeping Tom. Only peeping Toms are just an annoyance, whereas I know this guy had other stuff in mind. After just staring at each other for a moment, totally surprised to have come across one another, the guy made a beeline for the rickety old bridge. At first, seeing that made me feel like I was going to puke. I was praying that the worst it'd get would be him shouting, "Put some clothes on," or something. But the fact that he wanted to close the distance without even saying anything to me, he obviously didn't have good intentions. I just burst into action and grabbed my car keys, clothes, and shoes, but they got tangled up in some blackberry vines, so I made the split-second decision to just leave my clothes and get out of there with my life. When I made it out of the blackberry bush, I could see he was crossing the bridge toward me rapidly. I got to my car, flung my door open just as he'd arrived. I locked the doors while he pounded on the hood of my car, just screaming and grunting non-verbally. The moment he went for my driver's side door, I hit the gas and took off as fast as I could. I looked back, and he was chasing after me. He must have run after my car for at least a mile until he faded from view. I was bleeding everywhere from running nearly without anything on through blackberry bushes, and I was wet, unclothed, shaking, and crying. Had I hesitated for just a few seconds longer, I don't think I would have made it out alive. Even typing the story out again all these years later, I'm starting to shake. I felt like I was being hunted. That is the only way I can describe it. I'll never, ever go back to that area. Since then, I always bring a hiking buddy with me when I venture out into the forest. That day is going to haunt me for my life. I've had many years of therapy, and that experience is still as vivid as the day it happened.
Hey guys, it's Rye Horror. It seems like many of you guys enjoy my animated stories, but only 27% of you are subscribed. If you want to see this channel hit 10k subs, then please like and subscribe. Now back to the show.
I'm a hydrologist, which basically just means I studied water for most of my 20s and somehow didn't go insane from the boredom. All jokes aside, it's actually much more interesting than you might think. And if you get a decent degree from a decent college, then your job prospects are actually pretty vast. We work with farmers to ensure your food grows. We work with treatment plants to make sure your water's clean. We also make sure this water then makes it all the way to the comfort of your home in plentiful supply and without being contaminated. We also do things like survey sections of a river that have the potential to be dammed up. With good surveillance, a dam can be a source of plentiful green energy without being too destructive to the surrounding flora and fauna. And it was a surveillance job that took me out to the wilds of Washington during the summer of 2017. And given the time of the year, it seemed like a pretty sweet gig. On the surface, it was a highly paying, high-pressure job that could make or break someone's million-dollar government contract. But between you and me, it was a paid hiking vacation. I'd navigate around, assess the bedrock, make a few notes. I figured the whole job would take no longer than about 5 or 6 nights. That way, I could take my time, soaking up the pay as well as the sun. And I didn't last 3. By the evening of the 3rd day, I was hightailing it out of the woods as fast as I could, carrying only my car keys, my phone, and a survival knife. There's something going on up in the woods of Colville National Forest, and I think it might be very, very bad. The first day was when I arrived in a little place called Onion Creek, a quiet little town with a general store that I used to pick up a few last-minute supplies. When I asked the clerk for a good, quiet spot to park my car, the clerk was nice enough to offer me the free parking space around the back of the store, telling me he'd personally keep an eye on it while I was hiking up the pine-infested hills. The pines I was ready for, but the hills I was not. I like to think I'm quite an athletic guy, but my God did those hills take it out of me. Even walking in a snaking pattern to reduce the overall steepness, lugging my gear up the side of my first camp was nothing less than agony, and I slept like the dead that first night, having barely had the energy to get my work done. The next morning was more of the same, burning calves and a back soaked with sweat. But I was keeping positive, telling myself it made for one heck of a workout, even though I don't think I'd ever been that exhausted before. Worst part was just how bad I smelled, and the idea that I'd descend to the river, get nice and clean, only to be incredibly sweaty again by the time I got back to camp. It was like a hygiene-based Kafka-esque nightmare. I made do with baby wipes on that second night, promising I'd get an actual wash on the 3rd day, which would coincide with topping off my water supplies. So, the morning of the 3rd and final day, I wake up with a raging headache. I take some painkillers, put on my boots, then walk off into the woods to, do my business, only to find that my pee looks the color of Jack Daniels. I was seriously dehydrated, having rationed my water supply maybe a little too conservatively. I then take it upon myself to immediately hike down to the river, drink my body weight in fresh water, and actually get myself clean while I'm there. On arrival, I chug some water, then strip down to my underwear before immersing myself in the shallows, knowing I'd be able to change my boxers back at camp. I give myself a rinse, but as I'm getting up and getting out, I'd swear I saw something on the bank near where I'd left my clothes. I mean, unless it was a very isolated gust of wind, then something was definitely moving among the trees. I'm a little spooked, but having some deer watching me wash isn't anything to really worry about. So I just grab my stuff, towel off a little, then start hiking back up to camp. Later that day, as I'm out hiking, I start getting this god-awful smell from somewhere. At first, I was thinking it was me, like maybe my clothes just stank, or I'd been stealth sprayed by a skunk or whatever. But the further I walked, the stronger the smell got, until I was literally struggling not to retch at how bad it was. Then, right as I'm about to puke, I look up in this bid to get to higher, fresher air or something, and there it is. It was either a fox or a coyote, but in such a bad way that I couldn't tell the difference. It honestly looked like someone had caught the thing, then just beaten it to death before hanging it up in a tree. The only reason I could think for anyone to do that would be to, scare the foxes off a person's farmland. Brutal, but effective, I guess. But no, I don't think there was a farm for miles around. Yet it wasn't long before I realized that the fox/coyote thing wasn't the only corpse strung up in the trees. I kept walking, trying to get away from the smell. It was hot, so you can imagine how bad it was, but no matter which direction or how far or fast I walked, I couldn't seem to shake the smell of death. And like I said, that's because the dead were all around me. It got to the point where there was something strung up in every other tree in various states of decomposition. I spotted dead raccoons, rabbits, moles, and rotten weasels. Heck, I even think I spotted half a deer skeleton up there at one point. At least, I hope it was just a deer skeleton. After that, like I mentioned at the start, I basically just turned tail and ran. Didn't bother packing up my tent or anything like that. I just bailed back to where my car was parked in Onion Creek and just got out of there. I don't want to think about how much money I lost from walking away from that job. I'd type it out if I didn't think I'd puke all over my keyboard. But at the same time, I can't really think of a number that would make me go back out there and risk ending up like one of those poor animals, hanging in the trees.
Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek throughout woodlands and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, which is what I would need to do during the real thing, but we hiked 10 miles through woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, until all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or perhaps early 80s. Very pale, with liver spots dotting his face and a grey and white comb over to match. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought is that seeing some guy at this age out in the woods in these clothes and in these weather conditions is that this guy has certainly lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice, though, that puzzled me. He was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He began flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After a minute he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him and continued following the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope. It was probably a 40-degree angle and spanned for at least 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross it so quickly and cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see any fine detail clearly at all, but I swear he didn't appear wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. "Something's wrong here," he said under his breath. We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started to get irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down at the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services. That professional help would be on its way soon, and they would have all the tools that they needed to help. The old man then got furious and began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right away, or there would be hell to pay. His voice changed drastically at this point. He was now practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came in, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police so that we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and a pack of supplies like first aid and emergency blankets. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes, and the search lasted a weekend, but there was never any trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date.